Hopefully y'all listened to the lecture that I posted, because if you didn't, you're going to be lost today. And that's because we're going through some pretty difficult stuff. We started off with the fundamentals of what critical thinking is, what arguments are and their properties and fallacies. Then I tried to give you a classic example of critical thinking being used, and that we read the dialogues of Plato. And we talked about the arguments that Socrates gives for all of these different things. That was just getting our feet wet with respect to philosophy. It's a difficult discipline that requires a lot of thought and reflection. Well, on Monday, we began our real purview into philosophy. Now, philosophy is made up of different fields, such as ethics, social and political theory, but fundamentally, there are two that lie at the bottom. And I tried to convince you in the lecture that your views about the nature of reality and how you think we can acquire knowledge are going to inform all of your other views. Namely, what you think is right and wrong, how you think our society should be organized, how you think people should live, what we should judge them for, what kind of economic policy we should have, our laws, all of these different things. Those two fields that lie at the bottom, that inform everything else, are what we philosophers call metaphysics and epistemology. Metaphysics being, can anybody remember? Or read it from their notes? What is metaphysics?
The study of nature and reality. The nature of reality.
Right, the study of the nature of reality. What the heck is all of this stuff? Where did it come from? How does it work? That is what metaphysics tries to answer. And so metaphysics asks questions like, well, does God exist? Because if God exists, that's going to have a lot of implications for what this all means and how it works, how it operates. It also asks questions like, well, what is knowledge? And how do we obtain knowledge in the first place? This is the purview of epistemology. Because if we don't know what it takes for something to be knowledge, if we don't know what the conditions of knowledge are or what knowledge is, how can we say anything justifiable about the world or about how things should be? Thus, I tried to impress upon you that your metaphysical and epistemological views, whether you think God exists, what you think all this is and where it came from, whether or not we have free will, all of these views are going to deeply inform all of your other views. Namely, whether Trump is a savior or a devil, how you think we should live our lives, what you think is right and wrong, and all the rest. So, we began investigating these two fundamental fields, metaphysics and epistemology. And we're doing that through Bertrand Russell's very easy to read Problems of Philosophy. Now, to just introduce you to some of the most influential views about what this world is, how it works, and how we obtain knowledge, I laid out three theories for you. The first one I laid out is what we call Locke's common sense picture of reality. This is what I call it. And it's an intuitive view. What is that view? Well, it basically says something like this. We find ourselves in the world. Oh, would you look at that? We're not the only things here. There are objects outside of our own minds out there in the world. And these objects have certain properties, certain shape, motion, particle arrangement, solidity, extension, whatever. Those objects, backpacks, desks, tables, chairs, they have their own existences, such that if, regardless of what we think, they are the way that they are. And regardless of whether we were here or we all disappeared tonight, those objects would still be here. The desks, tables, and chairs wouldn't disappear if, well, we disappeared. How do we come to know about ourselves and the nature of the world? Well, it's through experience. This is what we call Locke's empiricist view. Our senses, our eyes, ears, nose, mouth, sense of touch, give us information about the world. We form our ideas about the world through our experiences with these things. It is experience that provides us with the fundamental building blocks to form our ideas and views about reality. So that was the first view we laid out. The second view we laid out, well, it was a little more radical. I introduced you to the philosophy of Bishop George Berkeley, who takes Locke's empiricist epistemology to its logical conclusion. He says, Locke, you make this distinction between what you call primary and secondary qualities. You say all the ideas we have about objects are based on their primary qualities. Well, Locke, that distinction doesn't hold. As it turns out, all of our ideas about the world are a matter of perspective and perception. Where I'm standing and where you're standing, well, they're different. So of course my ideas are going to be different than yours. Not only this, if we take the empiricist view seriously, what we realize is that to say anything about an object outside of our own minds is to say that we are perceiving it. What does this mean? Well, Berkeley says somehow this means that the perception of an object and its existence in the world are inseparable. We can't separate them. But he goes further. He says, on the basis of this, I conclude, well, objects don't have any existences unless there are minds to perceive them. None of these desks or cups or tables or pens and markers would be here if it were not for a mind perceiving them. And so he says, the existence of objects, indeed the existence of reality, depends for its existence on minds. But not our minds. It's not as if, Fulton here is subjectively hallucinating all of reality for us. It's the divine, perfect, eternal mind of God that is holding all things in existence and who determines the kinds of ideas that we have by baking laws and regularities into the operations of the cosmos. A radical view, right? You're telling me, Professor Gunner, that this marker wouldn't exist if there wasn't a mind to perceive it? Well, that's what Berkeley says. We contrasted Berkeley's view with one other, what I called the contemporary scientific view. What is this view? Well, it's the standard view of what you might call the rational, experimental scientist. Generally, what does the scientist think? Well, they think, fundamentally, everything is a part and product of nature. There are no gods or spirits or demons or anything supernatural. Everything is natural, and it comes from the processes of nature. Berkeley's wrong, the contemporary scientific view will say. It's not that the world is only made up of minds and ideas, non-physical stuff, mental stuff. Rather, everything is just made up of this physical substance we call matter. And it manifests in the form of particles and waves arranged in different ways. And the particular arrangements of matter that we have, well, give rise to the properties of that object, so on and so forth. Thus, everything is just made of some underlying physical substance called matter. And furthermore, because everything is just made up of matter, well, through our experiments, we've discovered that there are regular ways that matter behaves, the laws of nature and physics and math and all that. And so, well, if we could completely understand this matter and those laws of nature, we could hypothetically explain everything in the universe just in terms of physics, chemistry, and biology. So, if the contemporary scientific view is right, well, we could explain all of the emotions and hopes and dreams that you have just by talking about physics, waves and particles, neurotransmitters and electrical impulses. That's what it all reduces to. That's what it is fundamentally. So, I introduced you to these three, different views of what these philosophers thought the world was and how it works. Well, we're going to continue doing that today by investigating Chapter 2 of Russell's Problems of Philosophy. But before we get into that, we're going to have a quiz on the reading for today. So, please put your phones and electronics away. Now, how are we to actually cultivate knowledge of the world? How can we actually figure out how the world works? Well, what Russell's Problems of Philosophy does is it provides a great example of how philosophers generally think through these issues and how they back up their claims about the world. He introduced you to the field in Chapter 1, and in Chapter 2 he continues along his line of thinking to, try to determine some of the fundamental features of this universe that we live in. He starts off Chapter 2 by noting, it's imperative to see if we can establish whether or not there are objects outside of our own minds. Why? Well, if we can't figure out whether or not there are actually things that exist outside of us, that has some implications for the nature of reality itself. Is there a firm distinction between us and the world? Is it all just a subjective hallucination? Or is there something out there that actually has reality and an objective existence in and of itself? Furthermore, if we can't establish that there are objects outside of our own minds with their own existences, Russell says, then we can't establish the existence that there are bodies out there, like human bodies. And if we can't establish the existence of human bodies, it doesn't seem like we can prove there are other minds, other people that exist. Why? Well, because how do we know whether or not somebody is a person or has a mind? Well, it's through observing the motions and behavior of their body. How do you know that I'm a person with my own consciousness? Well, it's because you're watching my body move. This is what your senses are giving you. And on the basis of my facial expressions and my communication and how I'm moving, you infer, oh yeah, that's another person there with a mind who's like me, who has desires and beliefs like I do. So, he goes through a chain of reasoning to try to establish if we can know that there are objects outside of our own minds. Now, how does he do this? Well, he invokes another very important philosopher in our Western tradition, René Descartes, who we call the father of modern philosophy. See, I introduced you to Locke and Berkeley and the contemporary scientific view, but it wouldn't be a crazy thing to say those thinkers wouldn't have their views about the world were it not for Descartes and the very influential work that Descartes did in philosophy and mathematics, in geometry. This guy Descartes was a big deal, okay? He was a true Renaissance man who, had a lot of education, was a genius, and he wrote a lot, pushing the bounds of the science of his day, developing proofs, doing experiments. In his philosophical work, though, Descartes had a particular method that he used, a particular method of rational inquiry. How do we obtain knowledge of the world and what it's like? Well, Descartes thought he had discovered the way to do that. He begins by doubting everything he thinks he knows. You have to start afresh. Indeed, one of his views was that, well, up until he wrote his work, the Meditations, he had accepted what other people told him and what his teachers told him as fact, and he didn't seriously investigate it himself. So, in his book, The Meditations, he sought to not only to try to figure out if what he knew was true and provide a fundamental, justifiable basis for that, but he also tried to do something massive. He tried to establish a firm foundation for philosophy and sciences moving forward, so that, well, if he could establish this firm and certain foundation, all of the philosophy and science that we would do on top of it, we could know is justified, and we could trust it, and we could believe in it. Thus, when Descartes was doing philosophy, he began with systemic doubt over his own views and beliefs. Then, he engaged in what we call analysis. We get this word analysis from a Greek word that means something like to cut up into its parts. What do you do when you analyze an issue or a problem? Well, you look at the whole and you cut it up into its different parts, and you look at what all those different parts are like, and you look at what the relationships are between the parts and how they fit together. That is what it means to do analysis. So he would take an issue or a problem and he would analyze it. He would cut it up into its parts and look at each one of those parts and how they relate to one another. After he had, using reasoning and logic, figured out what all those parts are and how they relate to one another, he would put everything back together through synthesis. Once he did this, he was able to recapitulate his arguments for those views and express those in rational fashion, using logos. So this was the method that he followed. And what we see in chapter 2 is Russell giving us a little bit of insight into Descartes' method and what he was able to establish in the Meditations. Now, what does he establish in that book? Well, he lays the foundations for modern philosophy, for metaphysics and epistemology in this modern period, which we might say lasted from, something like the 16th century to the 18th century maybe. Drastically influencing everybody after him because he was such a big deal and what he did was so ingenious and important. In contrast to Locke's empiricism, which argues that we obtain knowledge of the world primarily through our senses and through experience, Descartes said no. Actually, we obtain knowledge through reasoning, through the operations of our minds. This is the knowledge that is truly reliable, what can be worked out purely logically and justified purely with reasoning and logic. This is the view that we call rationalism. And his formulation of this view would give rise to, a big debate in the modern period about, how is it we obtain knowledge of the world and what kind of knowledge is reliable? Secondly, he laid the foundations for dualism. Monism is the metaphysical view that there is one substance that makes up everything in reality. Berkeley thought that one substance was the mind, the mental. The contemporary scientific view said it was, this physical thing called matter. That's what makes everything up and determines how it works. Descartes thought no. There are actually two fundamentally distinct substances that make up the things in the universe and determine how they work. There's what's physical, matter, but then there's what's mental, minds, ideas, and perceptions. These two things are fundamentally distinct. What is mental cannot be reduced to physical explanation. And we cannot purely make sense of what is physical just in terms of what is mental. These are distinct things. So the human being, for instance, is made up of mental stuff and physical stuff. We're some sort of composite of these two substances arranged in a particular way. Taking these views, and in tandem with his other arguments, we call the philosophy that he formulated generally Cartesianism, after his name, René Descartes. He thought that we could obtain knowledge of the world simply through a priori reasoning. Does anybody know what this Latin phrase a priori means? Yes. Previous to what? We get our word prior from this, right? Previous to experience. In other words, we don't need to have any experiences out there in the world in order to figure out how a lot of things work. We can just figure it out through logical reasoning. By thinking about the concepts that we have. So, Descartes thought that, no, we don't get our ideas from experience like Locke thought. We actually come into this universe pre-programmed with certain ideas and concepts already embedded in our minds. This is what he calls innate ideas. So God fashions us such that, look, when we're born, we have ideas and concepts, some, already just pre-programmed into our minds. They're there. We don't obtain them through sensually experiencing the world. And this view was a very big deal because it would come to influence the trajectory of modern philosophy. But why was all this a big deal? Why should we care about any of this? Well, not only because it has to do with the fields that we're exploring now, metaphysics and epistemology, and it's good for your historical education, but also because what Descartes does, especially in his work, The Meditations on First Philosophy, is he provides us with a sublime example of what it means to use critical thinking, of what it means to think through things and then rationally justify your views with argumentation. So, at the beginning of the Meditations, Descartes says, I've accepted what my teachers in the world have told me. I've based my beliefs on, well, what other people have told me how the world works and on my experiences. But I haven't actually sit down and reflected on whether or not those things are true that I think that I believe. Whether or not I have good reasons for my beliefs, good justifications. So he sets out to do that. He sequesters himself away in a cabin and he turns his mind toward, well, trying to figure out if his beliefs are true, actually investigating them, actually reflecting on them. What does he find? Well, at the beginning of the Meditations, Descartes is perturbed. He holds himself to the following standard, what we might call epistemic infallibilism. He says, okay, if I want to make sure that my foundations for knowledge are secure and justified, and if I want to establish a firm foundation for sciences and philosophy that are rational moving forward, I'm going to assume that if I don't know something with complete certainty, I don't have that knowledge. If I can find any reason to doubt a belief, I'm going to put it aside and say I don't know that to be true. And holding himself to this standard of complete certainty, trying to see if there's anything he can know with complete certainty, slowly he comes to doubt everything. For example, can you know with complete certainty that you're awake and in class right now?
Yeah, if you slap me, I'll feel it.
Is that a proof that you're awake? You ever been slapped in a dream?
No.
Maybe we need to incept you so that you can have that experience. Well, Descartes realizes, look, he's had dreams similar to the experience he's having now. And they seemed really vivid and real when he was in them. So he begins to doubt that he's awake. He begins to doubt that he actually has a body. He begins to doubt his senses. Why? Well, because look, the senses are not completely reliable. Any of y'all ever feel a vibration in your phone pocket and you're like, oh yeah, I got an Instagram notification. You go to check it, no notification. Y'all ever hear something that wasn't actually there? Or see something that wasn't actually there? So our senses sometimes deceive us. They don't give us 100% correct information about what's going on out there. Okay, so the senses, doubting that means we can't have complete faith in our senses. Likewise, he goes so far as to say, well, look, I can't even be sure, I can't prove with complete certainty that when I do math, that those mathematic operations are true and they actually describe the world. So he falls into this pit of doubt, of endlessly doubting things, and he doesn't feel like he can know anything. It seems no certainty, and thus no knowledge can be attained. He's figured out that, well, he can come up with doubts for everything he previously thought was true. That there are objects out in the world, that he has a body, that math is true and reliable. But he doesn't give up. He keeps reflecting on these issues. He keeps trying to pursue this path of, well, can I find something I can know with complete certainty? And so he devises what we call the evil genius or evil demon thought experiment. He says, okay, if I really want to establish a firm foundation for my knowledge and beliefs, and science and philosophy in general moving forward, I'm going to hold myself to a difficult task. I'm going to assume there's some sort of all-powerful being that exists, whose sole purpose is to deceive me. If I assume this is true, and I find something that I can know with certainty, despite that, I will have found a firm foundation for my own beliefs, that I can start building my own beliefs back up again. Well, what does Descartes do? Well, using reasoning, purely reasoning, he starts thinking about, if such a being existed, what would that imply about the world? What would that imply about his own mind? Well, what does he realize? He's come to doubt almost everything. But he realizes that there's one thing he cannot doubt. There's one thing that he can know with complete certainty. This is what we call Descartes' cogito. In a flash of insight, he says, cogito ergo sum, which in Latin means, I think, therefore I am. What does Descartes realize? Well, he realizes he cannot doubt his own existence. He can know with complete certainty that he himself exists. Why? How can he know this with complete certainty? Well, reason it out. Think about it. If you are doubting your own existence, what does that imply? That you exist in the first place, right? Could you doubt your own existence if you didn't exist? No. right? You need to exist to be able to doubt. And if there is such an all-powerful being that exists, whose sole purpose is to deceive him, he realizes, that must mean I exist. Because if I didn't exist, I couldn't be deceived. I couldn't be doubting. I couldn't be having these thoughts if I didn't exist in the first place. So, on the basis of this undoubtable maxim, Descartes goes on in the rest of the Meditations to try to build his knowledge back up from the ground up. He goes on to provide proofs for the existence of God. He goes on to demonstrate using reason and just thinking about and reasoning through concepts that he can trust his perceptions that are clear and distinct. And he goes on to, provide logical, reasonable justifications for a lot of the commonsensical views that we have. That there are objects outside of us, that there is an external world outside of our own minds that exists. He is engaged in a monumental thing here. And it would come to greatly influence Western philosophy moving forward. He reasons out that God is all good and all powerful. This is the kind of concept that we have of God in our minds that is implanted in us from the time that we come into existence. And since God is good, God would never deceive us, because that would mean God did something bad, and God can't do something bad. So, since God is good, it's reasonable to think that He has given us faculties with which to reason and understand the world that we can trust. Thus, it is possible that we can trust our perceptions and cultivate knowledge of how the world works and what's going on. But he makes an even bolder claim. He utilizes what we call the famous wax example to express quite clearly what our relationship to reality is. He has this piece of wax in front of him and he's looking up at it and he's thinking about it. It's a hardened piece of yellow wax. And he says, look, it has a certain shape, it has a certain color, has a certain hardness and thickness. But look, watch what happens when I bring it close to the fire I'm sitting by. It melts. Its smell changes. Its shape changes. All of the sensible things about it change. What it tastes like, what it looks like, what it smells like, what it feels like. So Descartes concludes, I know that's the same piece of wax I was just holding, but everything that my senses are giving me is something different now. Yet I know it's the same piece of wax. What does that show us? Well, it shows us we don't apprehend and understand the world through our senses. Because even when all the sensible qualities about a thing changes, we still can tell it's the same thing, even though everything outward about it has changed. Thus, it is through our minds that we apprehend the world and understand it, through the operations of reasoning. The senses are not ultimately where we get our knowledge from. It's not how we understand the world. It's through the mind that we do that. And in offering these arguments and in coming to these views, Descartes greatly influences the trajectory of Western thought in history. He offers his own metaphysical view of how the world works and how we know it. He ends up agreeing with Locke and the contemporary scientific view in some sense, that there are objects outside of our own minds with their own existences. But it's not through experience that we fundamentally and reliably learn how the world works. We come to knowledge of the physical world and non-physical things, like concepts and math and emotions, through logical reasoning and the operations of our non-physical minds. Thus, it is through the operations of our non-physical minds that we come to figure out what this stuff is and what's going on. So why am I telling you all of this? Well, because you have metaphysical views about how the world works. You have fundamental beliefs about what this stuff is, what it's made of, and how we know it. And unless you get clear on what those views are, you're not going to understand yourself all that well. You're not going to know exactly the reasons you have for thinking what makes something right or wrong, or why the world should be this way rather than that. But also we're going into this because Russell utilizes Descartes' philosophy in order to proceed along his train of thought in this book. See, even though Descartes was a genius, Berkeley doesn't think that he got everything right, okay? But still, what Descartes has done provides us with a great example of what using critical thinking looks like to come to knowledge about the world and to figure ourselves out. Does anybody remember from the chapter for today where Russell attacks Descartes' reasoning? Hint, it's on that board. Think hard about this. Think hard about the thing Descartes thinks he can know with certainty, and he can use as a basis for the rest of his beliefs and knowledge. Well, let's start with this. What does a view like this, a claim like this, require to be true? You're hitting on something important. Yeah.
Does Russell believe that, line, I think therefore I am, isn't exactly true? Because you think something is true, doesn't mean it's exactly true, or existing?
His reasoning isn't exactly that, but you've hit on something important and good. Is this true? I think, therefore I must exist. Descartes thought it was. But Russell notes there are some questionable assumptions baked into this. What are those questionable assumptions? Well, here's one. What the heck is that? What does that mean? What is myself? Can I prove that I, as a stable, permanent thing, exist because there's thinking going on here? Sage?
I remember now, like in the book, it was saying like, oh, the desk is gray, and it's not that you're seeing the desk is gray, it's saying that like a color is being seen instead of you're seeing it.
Ah, okay, yes. What does Russell note? Well, he notes that Descartes' argument is weak. This claim isn't well substantiated, insofar as Descartes cannot himself prove with certainty the existence of his own self. What does he mean by I? What does it mean to be a self? What is the self? You all are having perceptions. There are colors, right? You're hearing sounds. You're feeling the desk in front of you. On the basis of those perceptions and your reasoning, can you prove without a shadow of a doubt that you have a thing called a stable self that persists through time, that makes you you? Well, Russell doesn't think so. He says Descartes' argument is weak insofar as it doesn't prove with certainty the existence of this I. This is what it means to use critical thinking. When you encounter a proposition or a claim or a theory, you should ask, what assumptions are baked into that claim or theory? Are those assumptions true? Has the author offered evidence or argumentation for the assumptions that their view is based on? Well, Descartes doesn't do that in the Meditations for this I. He just assumes that he has a self that exists, that is stable through time, that is giving rise to this thinking that he's experiencing. But it would be more appropriate to say, well, we haven't proved the existence of the self yet, Descartes. All we can know with certainty is that thinking is happening. Is that thinking mine? Is that thinking somebody else's? Do I even exist? We haven't shown that yet, right? And this is what you should do when you're thinking about the views that we sketched out earlier, and as you're reading Russell's book. What are the claims he's laying out? What are the assumptions baked into those claims? Are those assumptions substantiated? Are they justified? Well, what does Russell go on to say? He says, okay, we can doubt the existence of our own self, but Descartes was onto something in the sense that we can't doubt the existence of our perceptions or our sensations. Can you doubt that you're hearing my voice right now? Can you doubt that you're having some sort of sensation when you rest your hand on the table? No, those just flood your mind, right? You just feel those things. You just have those perceptions. So, we cannot doubt that we have perceptions and sensations. We just have them, right? You're hearing something, right? There's a sensation of noise. You're feeling something. Maybe you're tasting something if you have gum in your mouth. I don't know. You can't doubt that you have those things. You're just having them, right? Now, there is something you can doubt, though. You can doubt your own judgments about what those sensations mean. Yeah? You can't doubt that you're feeling something when you rest on this, but you could doubt that there's this thing called a table that exists independently of you that's causing you to feel that, right? In any case, Russell is going to take this fact that we cannot doubt that we have sensations and experiences as his basis moving forward in the rest of this chapter. And again, he provides us with a great example of someone who's using critical thinking in real time to try to work out how the world works and whether or not these views are true. He brings up again the example that he mentioned in chapter 1, the table. You remember the table? Look at the desk in front of you, right? You're experiencing a certain color, you're seeing a certain shape, you're having a certain sensation of what the surface is like, right? Smooth, hard. What arguments might we come up with to support the commonsensical view that, yeah, there is actually a thing called a table with certain properties that exists outside of our own minds and are causing us to have those perceptions and sensations? Well, we can come up with perhaps a few arguments to support this commonsensical view, right, that most people have. I'm just going to abbreviate it. Commonsensical picture. CSP. Well, think about it. Why do you think there's a table that you're resting on right now? Why do you have that view? Why do you think there's this thing called the table that exists outside of your own mind? And it's not just a hallucination of yours. Say that again? Because you're touching it. Okay. Why else? Yeah. You'll fall forward when you're leaning on it if it wasn't there, maybe? Yeah. Okay.
How can we not trust our judgments if everyone else is having the same judgment as us?
That's a good question. Do y'all think there's a table in front of you? You think there's a table in front of you?
So are we all just crazy and we're just all hallucinating it?
Well, the fact that you can communicate with the people around you and they're like, yeah, there's a table in front of us. That might lead us to think, yeah, you're not crazy, you're not hallucinating. Why? Well, because we're all having similar perceptions, right? That we can confirm with other people. You think there's a table in front of you, I think there's a table in front of me, right? Yeah.
But how do we know what other people are thinking is still real and true? Other people can also just be our perception.
That's a good question. You might think, look, we can prove the existence of objects outside of our own minds with their own existences because we all have similar perceptions, right? And we can confirm that with others. But what does this claim assume?
It assumes that we have similar
Yeah. What else? Dig a little deeper.
That we exist, that other people exist.
Yes. This view assumes other people exist that are having similar perceptions that we are. And what did we say? We haven't demonstrated that other people exist yet, right? We're still trying to figure that out. This begs the question, okay? Because that is what is in contention. Whether or not there are things, such as people, outside of our own minds. So we can't use this as a basis for proving that there are objects outside of our own minds. Because we still haven't demonstrated that, well, there are objects outside of our own minds, namely people. So where will we start in order to try to justify this common sense picture? Well, Russell says we have to start with our own private experiences, our own individual experiences. That is, after all, you might think the only thing we have access to. Because you haven't proven there are people outside of you. You haven't proven there's a table in front of you. All you can know and have access to is whatever you yourself are feeling and experiencing. So that will be our starting point. That raises the question. Could everything that you're experiencing in this room just be a dream or hallucination of your own making? Is that possible? Is there anything absurd about saying that or logically contradictory? What do you think? Is there anything inconsistent or illogical about thinking, yeah, maybe this is just all a dream in my own mind? Sage?
I think he said that, like, if you had a cat, then if it was a hallucination or a dream, then the cat would cease to exist when he's not in the room or, like, not looking at it. And it wouldn't be hungry or anything because how can a hallucination or a dream get hungry or whatever?
Right. You're jumping ahead, but that's not bad. That is where we're going to go. He notes that, like, look, if you think this is all a subjective dream or hallucination, there's nothing absurd with thinking that. There's no logical contradiction here. But, what? Well, do you have a good reason to believe that what you're experiencing now is just a subjective dream or hallucination of your own making? You have a good reason to believe that. Doesn't seem like it, right? What does Russell ultimately say? Well, he doesn't give us the kind of certainty and proof that we might want that Locke's commonsensical picture is true. But, he says, there are merits in accepting Locke's commonsensical picture. Okay? Does anybody know what those merits are? Can you remember from the reading or use your critical thinking skills? If you think about the cat example that he brought up, why might you accept the commonsensical picture over the hallucination picture? Well, which view is simpler? Which one? I didn't hear you because if you used.
I said not the hallucination one because it's harder to just sit there and say that everything we've learned is just fake and it's all our own mind.
Sure. Yeah, Russell says, look, this picture is more parsimonious. It's simpler. It's a simpler explanation. And what? Well, if you accept this view, the commonsensical picture, what does that afford you? Well, it gives you a lot of explanatory power. It explains a lot about how the world works and why. More, perhaps, than this view. If you accept this view, that doesn't explain why things move the way they do. Why the things you're experiencing behave according to regularities, maybe. No, this commonsensical picture has more explanatory power. It can explain more of the world if we accept it. So, for instance, this view doesn't lead to the same kind of logical difficulties that the hallucination view does. And why can we say this? Well, again, recall the cat example that he brings up in the chapter. We have all these experiences, right? Like cats moving from place to place or cats feeling hungry. Maybe you're in a house and it has two doors and both doors are open and you see a cat and it's sitting there licking itself in front of the one door. And then you notice it moving to the right, disappears behind the wall. And then you see it pop up again. Well, what kind of view would explain your perception? Well, if there really was a cat out there who moved from left to right, right? It seems to make sense. It's intuitive, right? In this view, he says, this commonsensical view seems to be instinctive in us. Instinctive in the way that the hallucination view is not. This is how we are apt to think about and interpret the world. Thus, he says, it seems reasonable to accept Locke's commonsensical picture. That there's an external world outside of our own minds, that there are objects out there with their own existences, and that these perceptions that we're having of water bottle, microphone, bag, marker, these sensations and perceptions correspond in some way to what's out there. Again, we cannot prove this view with complete certainty, but it is the simpler explanation. It provides more explanatory power. Ultimately, all of what we claim to know is based on these instinctive beliefs that we have about the world. We should interrogate the beliefs that we have, but it wouldn't be sensical to interrogate every belief that we have endlessly especially if we don't have good reason to. So if we're trying to work out if our instinctive beliefs are correct or perhaps reasonable, we should ask, are our instinctive beliefs consistent with each other? Can they all be true at the same time? Well, which set of views or beliefs best explains our experience of the world? And finally, which beliefs are simplest, most parsimonious, don't have a great deal of assumptions that we have to prove? Through good philosophy, we interrogate our own beliefs and we try to come up with answers to these questions. So I hope as you go through the rest of this class, you will reflect on this stuff. What is it that I actually believe about the world and how does it work? Where do I think all of this came from and why? Do I have good reasons for that? And once you understand your own beliefs, then you can go on to trying to figure out if there are weaknesses in them, if you have good arguments and reasons for them. And when we defend our beliefs or when we argue for a view, well, we do that through logos, through argumentation. So as you're moving forward and you're engaging in the writing assignments, it might be beneficial for you to, define your terms and concepts, lay out the assumptions your argument is based on, and perhaps draw out the implications of your view. If your view is true, what would that imply about how the world works? Okay. I will stop there for right now. Does anybody have any questions? Please, if you want something clarified, let me know. Questions about Descartes' philosophy or any of this? Yeah.
Can you explain the cat example? So what is he exactly saying with that cat example?
Yeah. We've all had an experience like this, right? Exactly. Yeah. We have experiences that seem to line up with object permanence. Right? Look. This is your house. Okay? You're sitting in your living room. There's a door going into the dining room. There's a door going into the kitchen. Okay? What do you see? Well, I can't draw. But you see your little kitty who's happy. Okay? Hanging out. God, this is bad. Okay? Hanging out. Well, your cat, like cats are bound to do, isn't going to stay still forever. And you notice it moves. And slowly you see it start to disappear from your line of sight and, it seems to be heading in that direction.
What is he exactly saying about it?
He's saying that because it seems like our experiences of things exhibit object permanence, that is best explained by this view. If everything was a hallucination, why would things behave in an ordered and regular way? Like having object permanence, like, showing up here. What explains the behavior of things that are hallucinations? Well, they don't seem to be regular and ordered, but our experience of the world seems to be regular and ordered, right? Every time you encounter a table, you feel something hard. Whenever you see something move, well, it exhibits object permanence. So these views should lead us to think, well, this seems to capture our experience best, not the hallucination view. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay, anything else? Okay, well then I'll let you go on break. Give yourself 10 minutes, be back here at, give yourself a little more time. Be back here at 1:25.